A little girl asks her neighbor for help fixing her house. She says her mother is afraid when it gets dark. The man, previously distant, appears during the storm and changes their lives with a simple gesture. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you are watching from. Let's continue. The fine Seattle rain fell gently over Liberty Street in the Beacon Hill neighborhood, turning the uneven asphalt into a dark mirror that reflected the few lights lit on that winter night. Sarah adjusted the worn coat over Lily's shoulders as they walked hurriedly toward the rented house they had shared for nearly 2 years. The 7-year-old girl jumped over puddles with the innocent joy of someone who did not yet fully understand the precariousness surrounding their lives. The house stood in the middle of the block, an old construction of wood and exposed brick that carried the deep marks of time on its walls. The peeling plaster revealed layers of paint from decades past, each telling a silent story of families who had passed through. The wooden windows creaked with the north wind that blew hard in the months of December and January, and the front door, painted a faded green, had never closed properly since the first day Sarah received the keys from the landlord, an elderly man who lived in another state and cared little for renovations. "Mum, the door is crooked again," Lily said, as she pushed the old wood, which resisted before giving way with a sharp moan. Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest. That door was the perfect symbol of everything she couldn't fix in her life. It wasn't just a matter of warped wood or rusted hinges, it was the constant sense of vulnerability, the feeling that a single stronger gust of wind could expose everything she tried to protect. Every night before bed, she would test the lock, push the door hard, place a chair against it as an additional barrier, and yet spend hours awake, alert to any strange noise coming from the street. Fear was an invisible tenant sharing that space with them. It lived in the creaks of the wooden floorboards when the wind blew, in the shadows that danced on the cracked walls, in the heavy silence that preceded every storm. Sarah had learned to live with it the same way she had learned to survive on very little, stretching every cent of the salary she earned as an administrative assistant at a small accounting firm downtown. She turned on the living room light, a fluorescent bulb that flickered for a few seconds before fully illuminating the modest room. The old sofa pushed against the wall, the coffee table with one short leg supported by folded magazines, the worn rug that Lily insisted on calling magical because it had almost invisible star patterns. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, or at least it was what they had for now. While preparing a simple dinner of rice, beans, and scrambled eggs, Sarah watched the house across the street through the kitchen window. It was impossible not to notice the contrast. The 2-story residence, painted an immaculate white with large windows protected by elegant grates and a front garden that was always well tended, seemed to belong to another world, a world where doors closed perfectly, where the cold didn't seep through the cracks, where fear had no address. "Mommy, who lives in that pretty house?" Lily asked, appearing at her mother's side with a drawing in her hands. "The man who lives alone," Sarah replied, looking away from the window. "Now come eat dinner, my love." "Is he nice?" "I don't know, honey. We've never spoken to him. But he always waves when he sees me." Sarah didn't answer. She knew Edward Sterling only by sight. He was as punctual as a clock, leaving every morning at 7:15 for work and invariably returning at 6 o'clock in the evening. A civil engineer, according to vague comments she had heard from a gossipy neighbor, polite, reserved, almost invisible. In the rare moments their eyes met on the street, he would nod briefly and go on his way, always maintaining a respectful distance that bordered on isolation. That night, after Lily fell asleep clutching her tattered teddy bear, Sarah stayed awake in the living room, wrapped in a thin blanket, watching the door that wouldn't close right. The wind howled outside, pushing the old wood which groaned in response. She thought about calling someone to fix it, but the quotes she had gotten were all impossible. $200 to change the lock, $300 to adjust the frame, $400 to replace the entire door. These were amounts that represented weeks of food, essential bills, basic survival. She closed her eyes and imagined, as she did every night, what she would do if someone tried to break in. She would grab Lily, run to the back bedroom, lock the door from the inside. She would scream, call the police, pray. They were mental plans she rehearsed like someone memorizing lines for a play she hoped she would never have to perform. Across the street, in the house of solid walls and well-sealed windows, Edward Sterling sat in his silent living room, an untouched glass of whiskey on the dark, wood coffee table. He watched the television without really paying attention to the program. His mind was elsewhere, revisiting conversations that never happened, decisions he had made years ago, the deliberate choice to live alone, to keep people at a safe distance. Edward had built his life on pillars of control and predictability. After a childhood marked by emotional instability, by a mother who struggled alone to raise 2 children in precarious conditions, he swore to himself he would never live in chaos again. He studied with obsessive determination, graduated in engineering, built a respectable career, bought that house at 32 and transformed every room into a sanctuary of order and silence. But the silence over the years had begun to weigh on him. It wasn't peace, it was emptiness. The difference between the two concepts became clearer with every birthday spent alone, every holiday without visitors, every night when the only sound in the house was the ticking of the antique clock on the wall. He had noticed Sarah and Lily since the day they moved into the house across the street. He observed from afar as he observed everything in his life, always keeping a safe distance. He saw the woman leave early for work, returning late with the girl by the hand. He saw the light grocery bags, the simple clothes, the way she looked at her own house before entering, as if checking if everything was still in place. Edward recognized that look. It was the same one his mother had when he was a child, that mixture of exhaustion, worry, and a fierce determination to protect the little she had. It was a look he had spent years trying to forget. The week followed its usual rhythm. Sarah woke before sunrise, got Lily ready for school, and rushed to catch the bus that took her to work. Edward left punctually, locked his house with meticulous care, got into his car, and drove to the office where he managed civil construction projects. They crossed paths occasionally on the street, exchanged brief nods and went their separate ways. Until that cold, sunny Thursday morning arrived. Lily was playing on the sidewalk while Sarah tied her hair in a hurried bun, already late for work. The girl was drawing with colored chalk on the irregular cement, creating imaginary flowers and houses with smoking chimneys. When Edward walked toward his car, she looked up and saw in him something her childhood innocence had not yet learned to fear or question. "Mister, do you know how to fix doors?" Lily asked, standing up and walking over to him with the natural confidence of someone who did not yet know shame. Edward stopped, surprised. He looked at the girl, then at the mother, who was now approaching hurriedly, her face red with embarrassment. "Lily, don't bother the man," Sarah said, taking her daughter's hand. "But, Mummy, he lives in that big house. He must know how to fix things. Our door doesn't." "Close right," the girl continued, completely ignoring the growing tension on her mother's face. "And at night, Mommy gets scared because the wind pushes it and makes noise." The silence that settled between the 3 adults was as dense as the fog that sometimes covered the city on winter mornings. Sarah wanted to disappear, to dissolve into the air, to be anywhere but there, exposed, vulnerable, depending on the compassion of a stranger. "I am so sorry," she said quickly, pulling Lily firmly away. "She's a child. She doesn't know what she's saying. Come on, Lily, we're going to be late." Edward opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. He just watched mother and daughter hurry away, the woman with her shoulders tense from shame, the girl looking back with confusion in her eyes. He stood there for a long moment, the child's words echoing in his mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. "Lily's mommy gets scared when it gets dark." He got into his car and drove to the office on autopilot, his mind completely occupied by that simple and devastating sentence. All morning, while reviewing architectural plans and discussing budgets with clients, the girl's voice returned without stopping. During lunch, sitting alone in a restaurant near work, he imagined the woman awake at night, listening to the creaks of the door, counting the seconds between one noise and the next. He knew exactly what that feeling was like, because he had lived it. He remembered his mother locking and unlocking the door several times before bed, testing, checking, never fully convinced they were safe. He remembered waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of her footsteps circling the house, checking windows, looking at the street through the curtains. He remembered, The smell of dampness that permeated the walls on rainy days, the freezing sensation of the cement floor under bare feet on winter nights. His mother, Catherine, had been a woman too strong for the circumstances life had imposed on her. She raised Edward and his sister Helen alone after their father simply disappeared one morning without leaving a note or an address. Edward was 9 when it happened, Helen only 5. What marked him most wasn't his father's absence, but the constant fear in his mother's eyes, that silent dread of not being able to keep the family together, of not having enough money for rent, of something bad happening and her being alone to deal with it all. He grew up hearing her muffled sobs in the room next door, pretending to be asleep while she cried softly after the children went to bed. He grew up watching her stretch money in impossible ways, transforming almost nothing into minimally nutritious meals, mending old clothes until there was no fabric left to mend. And he grew up also watching the house they lived in slowly deteriorate because there were no resources to fix what broke. The lock that jammed, the window that wouldn't close, the roof that leaked in 3 different spots when it rained hard. His mother would place buckets around the house, and the sound of drops hitting the metal was like a constant soundtrack to Edward's childhood. That sound still visited him in occasional nightmares, mixed with the memory of the fear that everything would literally collapse over their heads. That memory he had tried to bury now returned with full force, bringing all the others with it. A childhood in a house as fragile as the one across the street. The cold entering through the gaps. The constant feeling that everything could crumble at any moment. And more than that, the painful memory that no one had ever appeared to help. No neighbor offered a helping hand. No distant relative called to see if they were okay. They were alone against the world, and Edward had sworn to himself, still a teenager, that when he grew up, he would never be in that position of vulnerability again. When he returned home that afternoon, Edward parked his car and sat for several minutes looking at Sarah's house. The green door was slightly ajar as always, and old chair was propped up on the inside, visible through the crack. He imagined their nightly routine, the ritual of trying to create security where it didn't exist. He imagined the girl asking if the door was closed tight before sleeping. He imagined the mother lying with a tired smile, saying yes, everything was fine. They could sleep peacefully. Children had a way of seeing the world with a brutal clarity that adults spent years learning to ignore. Lily had simply identified a problem and asked for help to solve it, without shame, without fear of rejection, without all the social burdens adults carried. She didn't know that asking for help was considered a weakness by many. She didn't know that Sarah was probably dying of shame for not being able to fix her own house. She didn't know that Edward had spent years building walls around himself precisely to avoid this kind of human connection. But she knew her mother was afraid, and for a 7-year-old child, that was enough information to act. For the first time in years, Edward Sterling felt something that wasn't just distant observation or vague solidarity. He felt an uncomfortable urgency, an impulse to do something that would break the invisible wall he had built around his own life. But do what exactly? Show up at their door offering help? It would sound invasive, presumptuous. He was a stranger. He had no right to enter their lives just because a child had asked for something with innocence. So he did what he always did when confronted with uncomfortable emotions. He went inside, closed his door, prepared dinner, sat in front of the television, and tried to convince himself that it wasn't his problem. But that night, when the storm arrived with unexpected force, bringing strong winds that shook the trees on the street and rain that fell in dense curtains, Edward could no longer ignore it. He stood at the second-floor window, watching the house across the street. He saw the light turn on and off in the front bedroom. He saw the woman's shadow passing by the window several times. He saw the door swaying with the wind, opening and closing, completely out of control. And then, for the first time in years, Edward Sterling made a decision that wasn't based on logic or careful planning. He went downstairs, grabbed his toolbox kept in the garage, put on a waterproof jacket, and stepped out into the storm. The rain fell violently over Seattle as Edward crossed the street carrying his toolbox. The wind pushed the water diagonally, soaking his pants even with the waterproof jacket he wore. The streetlights flickered with the instability of the power grid, creating dancing shadows on the wet asphalt. It was the kind of storm the city knew well in the winter months, when cold fronts came down from the north and turned the streets into temporary small rivers. When he reached the green door that was swinging uncontrollably in the wind, Edward hesitated for a moment. There was still time to turn back, to pretend none of this was his responsibility, to maintain the safe distance he had cultivated for so long. But then he heard a noise from inside the house, the muffled sound of someone trying to hold the door that insisted on blowing open. He knocked 3 times on the wet wood, not too hard so as not to scare them, but firm enough to be heard over the roar of the storm. On the other side, Sarah had her back against the door, using her full body weight to keep it closed while Lily clung to her waist, eyes wide with fear. When she heard the knocks, her heart raced. It was almost 10 at night. No one knocked at the door at that hour, especially during a storm. Her first instinct was to remain silent, pretend no one was home, and protect her daughter from whatever threat might be on the other side. "Sarah, it's me, Edward." From across the street, the male voice struggled through the door, competing with the sound of the rain. "I came to help with the door. I can fix it now if you'll let me." Sarah froze, not knowing how to react. Part of her wanted to open it immediately, to accept the help she so desperately needed. Another part, the part that had learned to distrust everything and everyone, screamed not to open it, to send the man away, not to owe favors to strangers. Lily looked up at her mother's tense face, waiting for a decision. With hands trembling slightly, Sarah opened the door just a crack, keeping her body as a barrier between the visitor and Lily. Edward was there, completely drenched, toolbox in hand, with the calm and respectful expression of someone who didn't want to invade, only to help. "Sorry to show up like this so late," he said, maintaining an appropriate distance. "I saw from my window that the door is giving you a lot of trouble with the wind. I can fix it quickly. You don't need to let me in. I can do everything from out here." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, searching for signs of ulterior motives, hidden danger, or anything that would justify sending away the only person who had ever offered to help. But all she saw was a tired, wet man, holding tools as if they were a peace offering. "All right," she said finally, stepping back and opening the door completely. "Thank you." Edward nodded and began working immediately, focused, methodical. He examined the hinges first, testing every screw, identifying the spots where rust and time had compromised the structure. Sarah grabbed an old umbrella and stood beside him, trying to shield him from the incessant rain, a small gesture that said more than any words. Lily watched from inside the house, fascinated. To her it was almost magical. A man had appeared in the storm, like the heroes in the storybooks her teacher read at school, and he was fixing exactly what she had asked for that morning. In a child's simple logic, that's how the world worked. People helped each other when they needed it, without complication. Edward worked in silence for nearly 40 minutes. He removed the old hinges, replaced corroded screws, adjusted the misaligned frame, and installed a new lock he had brought from home, one he had bought years ago intending to use on a project he never completed. His hands moved with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime working with structures, fixing, building, ensuring things stood firm. As he worked, memories continued to arrive without permission. He remembered being 12 and trying to fix the kitchen faucet that dripped non-stop, using improvised tools and an old manual he had borrowed from the library. He remembered failing miserably, causing a bigger leak, and seeing his mother cry, not out of anger, but out of pure exhaustion. He remembered swearing right then and there that he would learn to fix things, that he would never again feel helpless in the face of practical problems. It was this promise that led him to engineering. Not just the desire to build new things, but the deep need to understand how things worked, how they were fixed, how fragility was transformed into solidity. Every project he took on carried a bit of that frustrated child who hadn't been able to help his own mother. "There," Edward said finally, testing the door several times. "Now it closes well. The lock is new. This key is yours, and I've put a copy here in case you lose it." He pointed to a small hook he had discreetly installed on the inner side of the door. "You can sleep peacefully tonight." Sarah looked at the door, which now closed perfectly, without gaps, without creaks, solid for the first time since she had moved in. She felt something dissolve inside her chest. A tension she had carried for so long, she no longer remembered what it was like to live without it. She wanted to thank him properly, to offer something in return, to find words that expressed the magnitude of that gesture. But all she could manage was a soft, almost inaudible thank you. Edward packed his wet tools back into the box, wiped his hands on an old rag and prepared to leave. Before going, he took a simple card from his pocket with his name and phone number. "If you need anything else, you can call," he said, handing her the card. "Or just knock on the door. I'm always home after 6. Sarah accepted the card with both hands, as if it were something precious and fragile. Edward waved to Lily, who was still watching everything from the living room, and began to cross the street back home. The rain continued to fall, but he didn't seem to be in a hurry. He walked slowly, like someone who had just done something they had avoided for far too long. When Sarah closed the door, for the first time in 2 years, she heard the firm click of the lock fitting perfectly. She tested it once more, pushing hard. The door didn't budge even a millimeter. She leaned her forehead against the wood for a moment, feeling warm tears streaming down her face, mixed with droplets of rain that had splashed on her while she held the umbrella. "Mummy, why are you crying?" Lily asked, hugging her mother's legs. "I'm not crying, my love. I'm happy. Is the door good now?" "It's perfect. I told you he was nice." Sarah smiled through her tears and picked her daughter up, pressing her against her chest. That night, for the first time since they moved into that house, both slept deeply, lulled by the sound of the rain which now brought no fear, only the constant rhythm of something that stayed outside, where it belonged. Across the street, Edward entered his house still drenched, leaving a trail of water down the hallway to the bathroom. He took off his wet clothes, took a hot shower, and put on the comfortable robe he wore on cold nights. But he couldn't sleep. He sat in the living room with the glass of whiskey he finally drank, feeling something strange moving inside him. It wasn't exactly satisfaction, though there was a bit of that. It wasn't pride, though that was present too. It was something more complex, a mixture of relief and melancholy, as if fixing that door had opened something inside him that had been locked for years. It was the feeling of having done something that mattered, not for money, not out of professional obligation, but simply because it was the right thing to do. He thought of his mother, who had passed away 5 years ago from a heart condition that doctors said had been aggravated by decades of stress and worry. He thought of all the times she had needed help and hadn't received it. He thought of how different it would have been if anyone had appeared on those difficult nights just to say they weren't alone. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't fix the door of the house where he grew up, which didn't even exist anymore, demolished years ago to make way for a modern building. But he could do something now in this present that was still under construction. In the following days, the routine of the street returned to normal, but something had shifted subtly. Sarah still left early for work, but now she closed the door with a new tranquility, without looking back and checking it several times. Edward still kept his precise hours, but occasionally he would stop to wave at Lily when he saw her playing on the sidewalk. The girl had developed an immediate and genuine affection for the neighbor. Every day when she returned from school, she would run to his house just to wave through the iron gate. Edward, who had never known how to deal with children, found himself responding to the waves, sometimes even stopping to exchange a few words about her day, about the drawings she made, or about the dog she wanted to have, but her mother said they couldn't. Sarah observed these interactions with conflicting feelings. On one hand, she saw Lily's genuine happiness in finding someone who paid attention to her. On the other, she feared creating dependency. She feared her daughter would get too attached to someone who had no obligation to remain in their lives. She feared above all that Edward would one day simply stop responding to the waves, and Lily would be left heartbroken. So Sarah began to avoid passing in front of his house. She would change sidewalks when she saw him arriving from work. She had thanked him for fixing the door, but she didn't want it to turn into something bigger, into a relationship of debt or dependency. She had grown up hearing that nothing in life was free, that all help had a price, and she didn't want to find out what the price of that fixed door would be. But Lily didn't have those adult worries. She kept looking for Edward, kept drawing houses and doors in her notebooks, and in all the drawings, a tall figure now appeared beside the house, holding tools. When the teacher asked who it was, Lily replied simply that it was the man who fixed things and didn't let Mommy be afraid. A week after the door was fixed, Lily finished a special drawing. It was different from the others, more elaborate, made with care. It showed a house with a tightly closed door, lit windows, and on the porch a brown dog lying down like a guardian. In the sky, yellow stars and a full moon. In the bottom corner, in large, irregular letters, was written, "Thank you." When Sarah saw the drawing, she felt a pang in her chest. She knew exactly what her daughter intended to do with it. "You're going to give this to Edward, aren't you?" Lily nodded enthusiastically. "Can I take it tomorrow?" Sarah wanted to say no. She wanted to explain to her daughter that they shouldn't bother the neighbor, that he had his own life, that a door repair didn't mean friendship. But she looked at Lily's bright eyes, at the drawing made with such affection, and she didn't have the heart. "You can," she said finally, "but just hand it over and come back, okay? Don't go bothering the man." The next day after school, Lily crossed the street with the drawing carefully folded in her hands. Edward was arriving from work, taking his briefcase from the back seat of the car. When he saw the girl approaching, he felt that familiar discomfort of someone who had never known quite how to interact with children. But there was also something warmer, a sense of anticipation that surprised him. "Hi, Edward," Lily said, holding out the paper. "I made this for you." Edward accepted the drawing and unfolded it carefully. He looked at the colored lines, at the house Lily had imagined, at the guardian dog he didn't have, at the message written in crooked letters but full of meaning. He felt something tighten in his throat, an emotion that hadn't visited him in years. "It's very beautiful, Lily," he said, and his voice came out huskier than he intended. "Thank you, I will keep it very carefully. Do you really like it?" "I like it very much. It's the most beautiful drawing I've ever received." Lily smiled with that complete joy that only children can express, and ran back home, waving over her shoulder. Edward stood there, holding the paper as if it was something infinitely precious. He went inside, and for the first time in years, didn't tuck something important away in a forgotten drawer. He pinned the drawing with a magnet to the refrigerator door, where he could see it every day. That night, while preparing his usual solitary dinner, Edward looked at the drawing several times. He looked at the house Lily had imagined safe and bright. He looked at the dog she had included for protection. And he wondered exactly when he had stopped imagining things like that, when he had stopped believing that houses could be more than physical structures, that they could be homes full of life and laughter and drawings on the fridge. The answer came all too easily. It was when he had decided that feeling too much was too expensive, that getting involved in other people's lives meant risking being hurt, abandoned, disappointed. It was when he had built invisible walls around himself, as solid as the houses he designed. But those walls were starting to show cracks, and for the first time in a long time, Edward Sterling wasn't sure he wanted to fix them. The following weeks brought an almost imperceptible change to the dynamics of that quiet Beacon Hill street. To the most attentive neighbors, Sarah and Edward remained just acquaintances who exchanged polite nods when crossing paths on the sidewalk. But for anyone looking more closely, small details revealed a silent approach happening bit by bit, like plants that grow, too slowly to be noticed from one day to the next. Edward had started going for walks in the late afternoon, something he had never done before. He would pass in front of Sarah's house always around 6:30, when she was usually returning from work with Lily. He didn't stop to talk, he just waved, asked how the day had been, commented on the weather. Brief, superficial conversations, but they happened with a regularity that was not accidental. Sarah noticed, of course. She noticed and didn't quite know how to feel about it. Part of her appreciated that constant, but respectful presence, that interest that didn't invade but was always there, available. Another part remained suspicious, waiting for the moment when Edward would charge her in some way for the fixed door, for the time dedicated, for the attention given to Lily. Because that's how the world worked in Sarah's experience. Nothing was truly free. There was always a hidden expectation, a veiled interest, a bill that appeared sooner or later. She had learned this in the most painful way possible from Lily's father, a man who disappeared as soon as he discovered the pregnancy, leaving behind only empty promises and a zeroed bank account. Since then, Sarah had built armor around her heart. She didn't let anyone get too close. She kept co-workers at a polite professional distance. She turned down invitations to go out. She concentrated all her energy on Lily and daily survival, with no room for dreams or expectations that could collapse on her again. But Edward didn't fit the patterns she knew. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't make insinuations. He didn't try to create situations to be alone. He was simply there, constant as the predictability of his schedule, offering a presence Sarah didn't quite know how to interpret. It was on a Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks after the door was fixed, that something changed again. Sarah was returning from the store, carrying 2 heavy bags that stretched her arms. Lily walked beside her, holding a smaller bag with vegetables. The day was warm, unusual for late autumn, and Sarah felt sweat running down her back as she walked up the slightly inclined street. Edward was washing his car in front of his house when he saw them passing. He turned off the hose immediately and crossed the street. "Let me help," he said, reaching for the bags before Sarah could protest. "You don't need to, I can manage." "I know you can, but you don't have to manage alone when there's someone here who can help." The sentence hung in the air between them, carrying a weight that went beyond grocery bags. Sarah looked at Edward, at his still extended hands, at the honest expression on his face, and something inside her gave way a little. She handed over the bags without saying anything. They walked the few meters to Sarah's house in silence. Lily prattled on about a cartoon she had watched that morning, filling the space with her innocence. When they reached the door, Edward set the bags down carefully on the ground. "Thank you," Sarah said, and this time there was more than just politeness in the word. There was something more genuine. "Anytime you need." Edward went back to his house and resumed washing his car, but his mind was completely elsewhere. He thought about how tired Sarah looked, how she carried too much weight both literally and figuratively, and how she had accepted his help with a reluctance he perfectly understood, because he was the same way. That night, while Sarah prepared dinner with the food she had bought, she found herself thinking about Edward in a way she hadn't allowed herself in years. Not romantically, not yet, but with a genuine curiosity about who this man was who had appeared in her life so unexpectedly. What motivated him? Why did he live alone in such a large house? Did he have family, friends, a story that explained that reserved but kind way of existing in the world? She shook these thoughts off firmly. She couldn't allow herself curiosity about Edward. Curiosity led to interest. Interest led to closeness. Closeness led to emotional dependence and eventual disappointment. It was better to keep things as they were, simple and superficial, to accept his kindness without trying to understand where it came from. But the universe had other plans. 2 days later, as Sarah hurried out to work, leaving Lily at the neighbor's house who watched the girl until school time, she witnessed a scene that would completely change her perception of Edward. An elderly woman had tripped and fallen on the sidewalk a few meters ahead. Sarah dropped her bag immediately and ran to help, kneeling beside the woman who was groaning in pain, clutching her knee. The woman must have been in her early 70s, white hair tied in a bun, simple but clean clothes, and in her eyes was that particular fear of elderly people who know that a fall can mean serious complications. "Are you okay, ma'am?" Sarah asked, helping her sit up carefully. "My knee," the old woman murmured, eyes full of tears. "I think I twisted it. I'll call an ambulance." No, please. I live just around the corner. If someone could just help me home." Sarah looked around for help. It was early, few people on the street. That was when she saw Edward leaving his house for work. He had already noticed the situation and was walking quickly toward them. "What happened?" he asked, kneeling down beside the woman as well. "She fell and hurt her knee. She lives just around the corner." Edward examined the old woman's knee with professional care, asking permission before touching, explaining every move he made. Sarah watched, fascinated. There was a genuine kindness in the way he treated the woman, a patience that contrasted with the rush everyone seemed to be in on a Monday morning. "I'll take her home," Edward said. Then I'll call a doctor to examine it properly. I don't want to be a bother, young man. It's no bother at all, Mrs. Gable. My name is Irene Gable. Mrs. Gable, it will be a pleasure to help you. Now, I'm going to pick you up carefully, okay? The old woman nodded, still embarrassed but clearly relieved. Edward lifted her with surprising ease, as if she weighed nothing, and began walking in the direction she indicated. Sarah accompanied them, carrying the woman's bag and her own, completely forgetting about the work she was supposed to be heading to. Mrs. Gable lived in a small, well-kept house 3 doors down. Edward deposited her carefully on the sofa, adjusted cushions under the injured knee, got ice from the fridge without being asked, and improvised a compress. Sarah watched all of this with a strange feeling forming inside her, something she couldn't completely name, but it had to do with seeing a person act without expecting anything in return. "Is there someone we can call? A family member?" Edward asked. "My son lives in Tacoma. I don't want to worry him with this." "Mrs. Gable, with all due respect, you need to see a doctor. I can take you now if you'll let me." The old woman looked at Edward, then at Sarah, and her eyes filled with tears again, but this time they weren't from pain. "You are both very kind. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank us," Sarah said, surprised by her own voice. "It's what anyone would do." "But it isn't, is it? It's not what just anyone does. You know that as well as I do." Mrs. Gable's words echoed in Sarah's mind throughout the drive to the hospital, where Edward insisted on taking the woman, even though it meant being late for work. Sarah called her boss asking for an hour's grace, something she had never done before, and stayed with them until a doctor examined Mrs. Gable and confirmed it was just a minor sprain. On the way back inside Edward's car, a comfortable silence settled between them. It wasn't the tense silence of strangers forced to share a space, but something softer, more natural. "Do you do this often?" Sarah asked finally. "Do what?" "Help people you barely know." Edward was silent for a moment, focused on the road. "Not often. In fact, almost never. I spent years avoiding getting involved in anyone's life." "Then why now?" "I think I found good reasons to change." Sarah looked out the window, processing those words and everything they could mean. When Edward stopped the car in front of her house, she hesitated before getting out. "Thank you for what you did for Mrs. Gable, and for everything. You helped too. But you could have pretended you didn't see. You could have gone straight to work. So could you." "Touché." Edward smiled, a small but genuine smile that lit up his serious face. "Look, I know you have reasons not to trust people," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know what those reasons are, and I won't ask. But I want you to know that I don't expect anything from you. The door I fixed, the help today, anything I do doesn't have a price tag. It's just kindness. Kindness I should have received as a child and didn't. Kindness I want to pass on now that I can." Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. She wanted to say something, but the words all got jumbled, and what came out, was just a husky, insufficient "thank you." She got out of the car quickly, before the tears burning behind her eyes could fall. That night, alone after Lily fell asleep, Sarah sat in the living room and allowed herself to really think about Edward for the first time. Not about the defenses she had built around him, not about the automatic suspicions she activated with anyone who approached, but about who he really seemed to be. A lonely man who understood loneliness. A man who carried his own scars but didn't let them stop him from having empathy for others. A man who fixed doors and carried old ladies and asked for nothing in return because he understood, perhaps better than anyone, what it was like to need help and not receive it. Sarah took out the card he had left weeks ago, with his name and phone number printed simply. Edward Sterling, civil engineer. A cell phone number, nothing more. She kept the card in her wallet, in a pocket where she could easily find it if she needed to. She wouldn't call now, maybe she would never call, but knowing she could, that there was someone across the street who really cared without ulterior motives, was a comfort she didn't know she needed until she had it. Across the street, Edward was also awake, sitting in the leather armchair in the living room with an open book in his lap that he wasn't reading. He thought about Sarah, about the way she had looked at him in the car, that second of vulnerability before she raised her defenses again. He recognized that look because he saw it in the mirror every day. Two hurt people trying to protect the pieces that remained. Two people who learned the hard way that trusting was expensive. Two people who were, without fully realizing it, beginning to trust each other despite all the reasons not to. Edward looked at Lily's drawing still pinned to the fridge. The bright house, the secure door, the protective dog. A drawing made by a child who still believed the world could be good, that people could help each other simply because it was the right thing to do. Maybe, Edward thought, maybe it was time to start believing in that too. Maybe it was time to stop living as if kindness were always a transaction, as if caring for someone inevitably meant being hurt. Maybe, just maybe, he could allow those cracks in his walls to widen a little more. Not in a reckless or desperate way, but with the same careful patience with which he fixed structures, brick by brick, choice by choice. And for the first time in years, the silence of his large, quiet house didn't feel like peace won, but like something he was ready to change. The month of January brought with it the intense cold characteristic of the Pacific Northwest winter. Seattle woke up covered in dense fog in the mornings, and the wind cut through the skin of anyone who ventured into the streets without proper clothing. In Sarah's house, despite the door now being tightly closed, the cold still found ways through the poorly sealed baseboards, through the old wooden windows that didn't fit perfectly, through the roof that let the heat escape. Lily would wake up shivering under the thin blankets they had, and Sarah would have to warm her with her own body before they got up for the day. The electric heater she had bought on sale months ago had burned out the previous week, leaving a smell of melted plastic in the air and a repair bill she couldn't pay. Sarah dealt with it the same way she dealt with everything, in silence, without complaining, stretching the resources she had. She dressed Lily in layers of clothes, made hot tea in the morning, and improvised hot water bottles with plastic jugs. They were temporary solutions for permanent problems, but it was what she could do. Edward noticed when he saw Lily going to school, wearing 3 overlapping sweaters on a particularly freezing morning. He also noticed that Sarah looked paler, more tired, her lips with that slightly bluish tint of someone who is constantly cold. He said nothing at that moment, but his mind was already working on solutions. 2 days later, on a Friday afternoon, Sarah arrived home and found a large box left at the door with a simple note taped to it. The handwriting was clear and masculine. "I found this kept in my storage. I never used it. Maybe it will be useful for you. No need to return it. Edward." Inside the box was an oil heater, practically new, still with the instruction manual. Sarah stood looking at it for a long moment, then torn between gratitude and that familiar discomfort of receiving help. She looked at Edward's house across the street. The curtains were closed, no sign of him. She knew she should refuse, that she should return the heater with a polite but firm thanks. She knew she was creating an emotional debt she couldn't repay, but then Lily appeared at her side, her eyes shining as she saw the heater. "Mommy, are we not going to be cold anymore?" And Sarah didn't have the heart to refuse, not for herself but for Lily, for the way the girl smiled, anticipating warmer nights, for knowing her daughter wouldn't have to wake up shivering under insufficient blankets. She took the box inside, installed the heater in the bedroom they shared, and that night, for the first time in weeks, both slept comfortably warm. But Sarah stayed awake for hours after Lily fell asleep, looking at the heater and thinking about Edward, about his persistent kindness, about how he was slowly breaking down all the defenses she had built. On Saturday morning, Sarah woke up determined. She couldn't keep just accepting help without giving back in some way. She needed to establish some balance in that relationship that was forming, even if she didn't know exactly what kind of relationship it was. She spent the morning in the kitchen, preparing a homemade chocolate cake from her grandmother's recipe that she kept in her memory. It wasn't much, but it was what she could offer. When the cake was ready and cooled, she covered it with a clean dish towel, took Lily by the hand, and crossed the street. Her heart beat faster than it should for such a simple task. She had never been inside Edward's house. She had never crossed that iron gate. That separated his world from hers. But it was time to start giving back, to show that she wasn't just someone who received, but someone who could also give. She rang the bell and waited, feeling Lily squeeze her hand with excitement. Edward opened the door a few seconds later, wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt, his hair slightly unkempt, his feet bare. He looked younger that way, more accessible, less the distant figure who observed from afar. "Hi," Sarah said, holding out the cake. "I came to thank you for the heater. I made this for you." Edward looked at the cake, then at Sarah, and something soft passed through his eyes. "You didn't have to." "I know, but I wanted to." A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but full of things unsaid. Lily broke the moment by pulling Edward's hand. "Can I see your house? Is it as big as it looks?" Edward laughed softly, a sound Sarah realized she had never heard before. "Do you want to come in?" he asked, looking at Sarah. "If it's not a bother." It never is. Edward's house was exactly as Sarah had imagined. Clean, organized, almost minimalist in the absence of personal objects. The living room had a large brown leather sofa, a bookshelf with technical engineering books and some novels, a moderate-sized television. Everything in its place, everything impeccably tidy, but there was something empty about it too, as if the house were more a functional space than a home, except for the refrigerator. When Edward took them into the kitchen, Sarah saw Lily's drawing pinned there with a magnet. That touched her in an unexpected way, seeing that he hadn't just kept the drawing but had placed it in a spot where he would see it every day. "You kept it," Lily said, pointing to her drawing with pride. "Of course I kept it. It's my treasure." Lily ran to examine the drawing more closely, touching the paper with reverence, as if seeing it for the first time. Edward and Sarah stood facing each other in the silent kitchen, and for the first time Sarah really looked at him without the layers of defense she normally activated. She saw a man probably in his late 30s, handsome in a discreet way, with tired eyes that suggested sleepless nights, a posture that oscillated between professional confidence and an almost adolescent uncertainty in social situations. She saw someone who, like her, was learning to trust again after having every reason in the world not to. "Your house is beautiful," Sarah said finally. "It's too big for just one person. Why do you live alone?" The question came out before she could filter it, too direct, too invasive, but Edward didn't seem offended. "A choice. Or at least, that's what I told myself. Now I think it's more fear than choice." "Fear of what?" "Of letting someone in and having them find out I'm not as good at being with people as I am at building houses for them." Sarah felt those words resonate inside her with a painful familiarity. "I understand that," she said softly. "I know you understand. I think that's why—" He stopped, as if he had come too close to saying something too important. "Why what?" "Why I'm not afraid to try with you, because you understand." The silence that followed was filled only by the sound of Lily humming softly as she examined the organized kitchen. Sarah knew she should say something, respond in some way, but the words all tangled in her throat. It was Lily who saved the moment, running back with her eyes shining. "Edward, you have a huge backyard. There's room for a dog." "I do," he agreed, grateful for the interruption. "But I don't have a dog." "Why not? Dogs are cool." "They are. I just never thought about having one." "We don't have one either," Lily said sadly. "Mommy says we don't have space or money to take care of one properly." Edward looked at Sarah, who confirmed with a discreet nod. It was true. Lily had been asking for a dog for months, but Sarah could barely keep the bills paid. Adding another mouth to feed, vaccines, a vet, it was completely out of the question. "You know, Lily," Edward said, kneeling down to be at the girl's eye level, "if I were to get a dog, you could come play with him whenever you wanted. It would be almost like having your own dog." "Really?" Lily's eyes lit up like stars. "Really? But you'd have to help take care of him." "I would help. Every day. I promise." Sarah watched that interaction with a lump in her throat. She saw the ease with which Edward dealt with Lily, the genuine patience, the real interest. It wasn't the performance of someone trying to impress the mother through the child. It was something more authentic, a connection that had formed naturally between a lonely man and a girl lacking father figures. They stayed longer than Sarah had planned. Edward served juice for Lily and coffee for the adults. They talked about trivial things, the intense cold of that winter, the repair work on the next street over, a new market opening in the neighborhood. Common conversations the kind neighbors have, but for both, they carried a different weight because they represented something neither had done in years, making room in their lives for another person. When they finally said goodbye and returned home, Lily wouldn't stop talking about the dog Edward had promised to get. Sarah listened to her half distractedly, her mind still processing everything that had happened that morning. That night, after Lily slept, Sarah sat in the living room with a cup of tea and allowed herself to seriously think about what was happening. She could no longer deny that there was something developing between her and Edward. It wasn't romance, not yet, but it was a connection that went beyond polite neighbors who occasionally helped each other. There was mutual recognition there. Two people who carried similar wounds, who built similar walls, who were discovering that perhaps they didn't have to live forever isolated behind those protections. But it terrified her deeply, because opening up meant risking being hurt again. It meant giving Edward the power to disappoint her, to abandon her, to prove that her distrust had been right all along. And if that happened, it wouldn't just be her suffering. Lily was already getting attached to him, already talking about the neighbor with that sparkle in her eyes that children have when they admire someone. Sarah took her phone and looked at Edward's number saved in her contacts. She could send a message thanking him for the morning, keeping the connection. Or she could let things cool down, create distance again, protect herself and her daughter from possible future pain. She stared at the phone screen for long minutes, her finger hovering over the keyboard, unable to decide. In the end, she locked the phone without sending anything. Some decisions needed more time, more clarity, more courage than she had at that moment. Across the street, Edward was also awake, the piece of cake Sarah had made sitting on a plate in front of him, untouched. He looked at that cake as if it were something much more significant than flour, sugar, and chocolate. It was a gesture, a bridge built in his direction, a sign that Sarah also felt that connection forming. The conversation in the kitchen kept echoing in his mind. The way she had looked at him when he admitted to being afraid of not being good with people. The way she had said she understood. There was no judgment there, no impossible expectations, only recognition. Finally, someone who saw his flaws and didn't run away. Edward cut a piece of the cake and tasted it. It was delicious, moist and rich, made with care and attention. He imagined Sarah in her small kitchen, preparing that for him, and felt something warm spreading through his chest. Was he in love? He didn't know. It had been so long since he had allowed himself to feel anything like that he barely recognized the signs. But he knew that Sarah occupied his thoughts in a way no one else had in years. He knew he woke up hoping to see her on the street, that the days seemed better when they exchanged a few words, that the house felt less empty after she and Lily had been there. He picked up his phone, thinking of sending a message, something simple, thanking her for the cake, saying it was delicious. But the words seemed insufficient to express what he really wanted to say. That the morning had been one of the best he'd had in years, that their presence in the house had brought a life he didn't know was missing, that he was starting to imagine what it would be, like if that presence were permanent. But he couldn't say that. Not yet. Not when Sarah was still clearly struggling with her own barriers, her own fears. He needed to go slow, respect her pace, prove through consistent actions that it was safe to trust him. So Edward also locked his phone without sending anything. Some things needed to be said in person, or better yet, shown through small gestures repeated over time. The following Sunday, Edward woke up with a purpose. If he was going to do this, really do it, he needed to start transforming his house into something more than an empty structure. He needed to create a space that could welcome other people, especially a 7-year-old girl who dreamed of dogs. He spent the day reorganizing. He didn't change much, but he added small touches. He bought colorful pillows for the gray sofa. He put up some framed photos that had been stored in boxes, images of his mother and sister, that he hadn't looked at in years because they hurt too much. He cleaned the backyard completely, mowed the grass that had grown too long, and fixed the fence that had some loose boards, and then, on Monday morning before going to work, he made a call to an animal shelter he knew. "I'm looking for a dog," he said, "preferably one that needs a home. I don't care about the breed or age. He just needs to be gentle with children." The shelter worker sounded surprised and happy. They had several dogs waiting for adoption. Could he visit during the weekend? Edward confirmed, noted the address, and hung up, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Anticipation. Not the heavy anxiety that normally accompanied changes in his life, but a light excitement, like a child waiting for something good. He was about to get a dog. He was about to add more life and mess and responsibility to his carefully controlled existence. And for the first time in years, it didn't scare him. On the contrary, it seemed like exactly the right thing to do. Because he wasn't doing it just for himself. He was doing it for Lily, who deserved to have a dog to play with. He was doing it for Sarah, who deserved to see her daughter happy without the constant weight of guilt for not being able to give the girl everything she wanted. And he was doing it for himself, because maybe it was time to stop living as if taking care of something, living and unpredictable, were too big a risk to take. As he drove to work, Edward looked in the rearview mirror at Sarah's house, at the door he had fixed weeks ago, and smiled. Small steps. That's how lasting things were built. Not with big dramatic gestures, but with bricks placed one on top of the other, day after day, until they formed something solid enough to withstand the storms. And for the first time in a long time, Edward Sterling believed he was building exactly that. Saturday dawned with a clear, cold sky, the kind of winter day Seattle offered occasionally between the grey weeks of January. Edward woke up early, excited in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Today was the day to go to the shelter and choose the dog he had promised Lily. He had breakfast quickly, got dressed, and was about to leave when he saw Sarah and Lily on the sidewalk. The girl was wearing a pink dress under her thick coat and was jumping from one foot to the other with ill-concealed excitement. Sarah held her hand firmly, clearly trying to calm her daughter's energy. Edward crossed the street before thinking twice. "Good morning. Are you going out?" "We're going to the park," Sarah replied. "Lily's been asking for weeks." "What a coincidence. I was going to the animal shelter today. Remember the dog I mentioned?" Lily's eyes widened like saucers. "Are you going to get him today?" "If I find the right dog, yes." "Can we go too? Please, Mommy. Please, Edward." Sarah opened her mouth to decline politely, but she met Edward's gaze. There was a silent invitation there, an unasked question. She could say no, maintain the boundaries, protect herself, or she could take one more step toward that connection the two had been building with care. "If Edward doesn't mind," she said finally. "It would be great to have your opinion. After all, Lily will play with him as much as I will." The shelter was in the north part of the city, a 40-minute drive away. During the trip, Lily prattled on non-stop about all the possible names for a dog, while Sarah and Edward exchanged amused glances in the rearview mirror. There was a lightness in the air that neither had allowed themselves to feel in a long time. When they arrived at the shelter, they were greeted by Caroline, a young veterinarian passionate about her work. She took them through the kennels, introducing the dogs available for adoption. There was everything from energetic puppies to older animals who watched the visitors with tired hope in their eyes. Lily stopped in front of one specific kennel. Inside was a medium-sized mutt, light brown fur with white patches, floppy ears and gentle eyes. The dog didn't jump or bark like the others. He just sat there, observing the girl with an almost human tranquility. "This one," Lily said with absolute certainty. "This is the one." Caroline opened the kennel, and the dog came out slowly, allowing Lily to pet him. He was a male, approximately 3 years old, found abandoned on the street 6 months ago. He had been treated for an injured paw and was completely healthy now, just waiting for a family. "What's his name?" Edward asked. "We haven't given him a name yet. We hope the adopters will choose one." Lily looked at the dog for a long moment, serious, as if she were having a silent conversation with him. "Rusty," she announced finally. "His name is Rusty." Edward knelt beside Lily, and held out his hand to the dog, who sniffed it before licking his fingers delicately. "Rusty seems perfect," he said, looking at Sarah. "What do you think?" Sarah watched the scene, her daughter petting the dog with so much love, Edward smiling in a way she had never seen before, and she felt something break inside her, not out of pain, but out of surrender. Surrender to the moment, to the possibility that good things could happen without being accompanied by tragedy. "I think he's already chosen you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Edward handled all the adoption paperwork, while Lily didn't leave Rusty's side for a second. They bought food, bowls, a comfortable bed, and toys. On the way back, Rusty sat in the back seat with Lily, his head resting on the lap of the girl who wouldn't stop petting him. When they arrived back in Beacon Hill, it was mid-afternoon. Edward parked in front of his house and looked at Sarah. "Do you want to come in? I need to get Rusty settled, show him where he'll stay. And I promised Lily she could play with him whenever she wanted." Sarah accepted, and for the second time, they entered Edward's house. But this time it was different. There was life there now, movement, a dog exploring every corner with curiosity, a child laughing, sounds that filled the silence that had once seemed so heavy. Edward prepared Rusty's corner in the backyard with the little house he had bought and the bowls of food and water. Lily helped with everything, serious and committed as if it were the most important task in the world. Sarah watched everything sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee Edward had prepared, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to have this always. A safe house, a happy child, someone by her side who shared not only the responsibilities, but also the moments of joy. The rest of the day passed too quickly. They had dinner together, a simple meal Edward improvised with what he had in the fridge. They laughed at Rusty trying to catch his own tail, and watched Lily teach tricks to the dog who clearly already knew how to sit and give his paw. When the sky began to darken, Sarah realized they needed to go, but something in her resisted. She wanted to stay longer, to remain in that space where everything felt lighter. "We need to go," she said finally. "Tomorrow is Monday and Lily has school." "You can stay a little longer," Edward offered, "or you could stay the whole night. I have spare rooms." It was an innocent, practical offer, but it carried a weight they both felt. Sarah shook her head. "Thank you, but no. Our house is right. There." They left with Lily protesting, wanting to stay longer with Rusty. Edward promised she could come back the next day, that the dog would be there waiting. That night, back in her house, Sarah lay beside Lily and stared at the ceiling for hours. Things were changing too fast. Her feelings for Edward were growing in ways she could no longer ignore, and it terrified her. 3 days later, on a Thursday night, the fear Sarah had carried for so long finally materialized. It was almost midnight when she heard the noise, someone tampering with the front door trying to force it. Her heart raced immediately. She grabbed Lily, who was still sleeping, carried her to the back bedroom, locked the door from the inside, and dialed the police with hands shaking so much she could barely hold the phone. Outside she heard low voices, the creak of the wood being tested. The lock Edward had installed held firm, but for how long? Sarah held Lily against her chest, her hand over the girl's mouth in case she woke up and screamed and prayed as she hadn't prayed since she was a child. Suddenly lights came on outside. Lots of lights. An alarm began to sound, loud and shrill. Startled voices, running footsteps, the sound of someone fleeing in a hurry. Sarah didn't understand what was happening. Minutes later, which felt like hours, the police arrived. They knocked on the door, identifying themselves. Sarah came out of the room trembling, opening the door still protected by the chain. 2 officers were there, and behind them, Edward, wearing only sweatpants and a t-shirt, bare feet, his face worried. "Is everything okay?" was the first thing he asked. "Are you two okay?" Sarah nodded, unable to speak. One of the officers explained that a security system had been triggered, alerting them to suspicious movement. The cameras caught 2 people trying to break down the door before they fled, scared by the lights and the alarm. "What system?" Sarah asked, confused. Edward lowered his eyes, almost embarrassed. I installed it discreetly last week. Motion sensors, cameras, automatic lights, everything connected to my phone. When the alarm went off, I called the police immediately and came running. You did that without telling me? I'm sorry, I knew you would refuse if I asked permission, but I couldn't sleep knowing you were here without proper protection. The officers took the report, reassured Sarah saying the suspects probably wouldn't return, and left. Edward stayed, standing in the doorway, not knowing if he should leave or stay. Thank you, Sarah said finally, her voice breaking. You saved us. You don't need to thank me. I'll never let anything bad happen to you if I can help it. I can't stay here tonight, Sarah admitted, the tears finally falling. I'm too scared. I know it's silly that they won't come back, but I can't. Then come to my house, at least for tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do. This time Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed some clothes, toiletries, and important documents. Edward carried Lily, still sleeping, in his arms. The girl only murmured something about Rusty before falling back into a deep sleep. In Edward's house, he settled them in the guest room. Clean sheets, thick blankets, a lamp lit, creating a soft, comforting light. Sarah laid Lily on the king-size bed, tucked her in carefully, and then collapsed. All the emotions she had held back during the scare, all the accumulated fear of years, all the exhaustion of carrying everything alone. It all came to the surface at once. She cried, deep sobs that shook her entire body, and Edward just held her, letting her break down without judgment, without rush. When the tears finally ceased, they sat side by side on the edge of the bed in silence. Sarah looked at Lily, sleeping peacefully, oblivious to it all. I don't know how to keep going like this, she said. Alone, scared all the time, pretending everything is fine when nothing is. You're not alone. Not anymore. Sarah looked at Edward, really looked, and saw everything he was offering without saying it out loud. Security, yes, but also companionship, understanding, presence. She saw a man who understood her scars because he had his own, who respected her fears because he also feared, who was willing to walk slowly because he knew that big changes took time. In the following days, Sarah and Lily stayed at Edward's house. It wasn't exactly temporary, but it wasn't permanent yet either. It was an intermediate space where everyone learned to live together, to share routines, to transform 3 separate lives into something that was beginning to look like a family. Sarah cooked, transforming Edward's spotless kitchen into a more living space with spices out of order and dish towels hung randomly. Lily filled the house with laughter, drawings stuck to every magnetic surface, toys scattered on the floor. Rusty circulated among everyone, a 4-legged link that connected them. Edward discovered he liked the controlled chaos they brought. He liked waking up to the smell of coffee he hadn't prepared, tripping over small shoes left in the hallway, hearing voices filling the silence that had once seemed comfortable, but now revealed itself as merely lonely. A week later, Edward asked Sarah to sit with him in the living room after Lily went to sleep. He had something important to say. I did something, he began, nervous in a way Sarah had never seen. And you might get mad, and I'll understand if you do. But I have to tell you. Edward, you're scaring me. I bought the house where you were living, and I transferred the deed to your name and Lily's. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah looked at him without fully understanding. You did what? The house had been for sale for months. The owner wanted to get rid of it. I bought it and transferred it to your names, not as charity, he hurried to explain, seeing Sarah's expression. As a guarantee, so you never have to fear eviction or late rent or not having a place to stay again. The house is yours, legally, forever. Edward, I can't accept that. Yes, you can. Because it's not about you owing me anything. It's about you deserving to have your own place, safe, where you can raise your daughter without fear. If you want to move back there, the house is waiting. If you want to rent it out and have extra income, you can do that. If you want to sell it one day, it's your right. There are no conditions, no strings attached. It's just yours. Sarah felt the tears return, but this time they were different. They weren't from fear or exhaustion, but from something she barely remembered feeling. Hope. The real possibility of a different future. Why are you doing this for me? Because you deserve it. Because Lily deserves it. And because I've spent my whole life building houses for other people to live in, and I finally found someone I want to see happy in one of them." Sarah stepped closer and for the first time kissed Edward. It wasn't dramatic or passionate, it was soft, careful, full of unspoken promises. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. The following months were a time of reconstruction. Edward hired a crew to completely renovate the house that now belonged to Sarah. A new roof, updated plumbing, fresh paint, windows that closed perfectly. Sarah participated in every decision, choosing colors and materials, transforming that structure into something that truly felt like a home. But she didn't live there. She stayed at Edward's house because that was where she wanted to be. Eventually, they rented the renovated house to a young single mother who needed a safe place to start over, and Sarah felt she was passing on the kindness she had received. A year later, on another rainy winter night, the storm returned with force. The wind shook the trees, the rain beat against the windows, but inside Edward's house, now everyone's house, there was only warmth and light. Lily, now 8 years old, was drawing in the living room when she heard a familiar creak coming from the front door. Her eyes lit up and she ran down the hallway. "Mommy, Edward, the door broke again." Edward appeared. From the kitchen, drying his hands on a cloth, Sarah came down the stairs, smiling. Rusty barked once, excited by Lily's energy. "Did it really break?" Edward asked, picking Lily up. "I think so. It's making that noise." "Then we're going to have to fix it together, aren't we?" "Can I help?" "Of course you can. You're my official repair assistant." Lily laughed, that clean, happy laugh of children who grow up surrounded by love. Edward walked with her to the door, Sarah and Rusty following behind. The door wasn't actually broken. The strong wind had just made it creak a bit, but Edward took a screwdriver and pretended to tighten some screws while Lily held the phone's flashlight, completely serious in her mission. "There," Edward announced. "It's firm again." Sarah watched that scene, her heart so full it seemed impossible to fit any more love there. This was her family, not perfect, not traditional, but built with care, with small gestures repeated day after day, with the courage to trust when every instinct screamed to protect herself. Outside, the storm continued, but inside, surrounded by solid walls lit by warm lights, protected not only by locks and alarms, but by love and constant presence, they were safe. Sarah approached Edward and Lily, hugging them both. Rusty squeezed between her legs, completing the circle. And there, in that embrace, in that house that had ceased to be one person's and become everyone's, Sarah finally understood what the premise had always been. Homes are not built only with walls and roofs. They are built with respect, with daily care, with the courage to stay even when fear says to run. They are built with doors that sometimes break but can always be fixed, as long as there are hands willing to work together. And for the first time in her life, Sarah wasn't afraid of tomorrow, because she knew with the deep certainty that comes from the heart and not from reason, that no matter what storms came, they would face them together. The door was firm, the house was safe, the family was complete, and that was all they ever needed. The end. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Sarah, Edward, and Lily has touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of overcoming, trust and love built bit by bit, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment marked you the most. Was it the first time Edward fixed the door, the day Rusty arrived, or the final hug that sealed this beautiful family? Every day, we bring intense stories like this one, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul, reminding us that we are never truly alone when we have the courage to let someone in. We'll see you in the next episode with another story that will stir your emotions.